Welcome everybody to the Australian Intercultural Society's webinar, Why Doesn't She Just Leave? Breaking the Cycle of Domestic Violence. My name is Karen Percy. I'm a freelance journalist. I'm on the advisory board of the Australian Intercultural Society. I'm also the president of the media section of the Media Entertainment and Arts Alliance, an elected position where I represent journalists in this country. I acknowledge the lands that we're all today meeting on. I'm actually on Kaurna land in Adelaide today. I was born on the land of the Larrakia, and ordinarily I live in Melbourne and work on Boonwurrung and Woiwurrung land, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and especially any First Nations people who might be joining us today. Bit of a content warning. This is likely to be a challenging and perhaps confronting conversation. I also know it's going to be inspiring, haven't already spoken to these amazing women, but I just note that this could be triggering for you. So just be mindful, and if you need to take a break or access any services yourself, please do that. Domestic violence in any form is a major social issue that can have lifelong impacts for victims. And according to the 2021 Victorian Family Domestic Database, the number of family violence incidents recorded by Victoria Police increased by 6% in that time. 1/3 domestic violence cases in Victoria are against a person. That includes talking, harassment, threatening, are family violence related. Even matters discussed pre-marriage like dowry resurface during domestic disputes between couples. The true incidence of dowry abuse, for example, in Australia is unknown, but a national survey in 2020 completed largely by the South Asian community found about 1/3 of respondents said they had suffered dowry abuse themselves or knew somebody who had. Now, the Australian Intercultural Society is a not-for-profit organisation that promotes multiculturalism and fostering intercultural and interfaith dialogue. They have a lot of these terrific discussions, and the AIS believes in reaching out to all members of society by providing a platform for cultural and information exchange. So, just how big is the problem of family violence? Are we just more aware of it? Is there more reporting of it? Or truly are we seeing a lot more violence in the family home and between intimate partners? Dowry abuse and coercive control by partners is becoming an increasing concern for many communities. So how do governments and non-government entities address the common causes of domestic abuse? That's what we're going to be chatting about today, among other things, and we've got some really terrific experts with us today. Professor Manjula Datta O'Connor is a psychiatrist in private practice with clinical and research interest in migrant women's mental health, family violence and complex trauma and trauma therapy. Manjula co-founded the Australasian Centre for Human Rights and Health. That happened in 2012. She successfully led the dowry abuse campaign in Australia, culminating in law change here in Victoria, and is currently advocating to change federal laws to ensure dowry gifts are quarantined in family property disputes. Welcome, Manjula.
Thank you.
Maria Dimopoulos is nationally and internationally recognised as an expert in social justice reforms. She's passionate about human rights, especially women's rights, and continues to work for increased cross-cultural understanding and the advancement of women. Maria is currently the chairperson of Safe and Equal, a member of the Coronial Council of Victoria, and a board member of Midsummer. Maria was appointed as a member of the National Council to Reduce Violence Against Women and Their Children and the Access and Equity Inquiry Panel, which conducted an inquiry into Australian government services to ensure they are responsive to the needs of Australians from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. And Mariam Chowdhury is an experienced leader in strengthening communities and building purposeful connections to promote social inclusion and diversity. Mariam is currently the Australian Government the Executive Manager, Sector and Community at In Touch Multicultural Centre Against Family Violence, and has previously worked across numerous public sector advocacy and social service agencies. Sorry for mucking that up, Mariam. I actually had it printed out twice and it went over on a page. Anyway, I apologise for that. Welcome to you all. I'm going to get each of you to give a very brief overview of the work you're doing now and the communities that you're working with. We'll start with you, Manjula.
Thank you, Karen. The work I do is around gender-based violence, trauma therapy, trauma-informed care in migrant communities and from across the world, really. And but I do tend to research focus on South Asian communities, and that's how I came to write the book Daughters of Durga.
And we'll be hearing more about that. Thank you. Maria, give us a quick overview of the work that you're doing and the communities you're doing it with.
Sure, thank you. And if I too could start by acknowledging that I'm on the lands of the Bunurong Boomerang at the moment. Whenever we are talking about violence, I think it's important to recognise the ongoing effects of colonisation. And I'm very heartened by the fact that the new national plan does indeed call for a separate series of actions and a separate plan for First Nations communities. Look, essentially the work I do feels very much one of collaboration with so many different communities, multicultural, multi-faith. You mentioned I'm the chair of Safe and Equal at the moment, which is a real highlight for me at the moment, because as a statewide peak body for specialist family violence services, it really is leading the way around addressing where some of the gaps are. And for me, a great passion is identifying those gaps as they relate to multicultural, multi-faith communities. So I'm very much speaking on behalf of myself at the moment, and certainly not representing the views of the organisation, but I am deeply, deeply passionate about the work that Safe and Equal do, both in Victoria and at federal level. Thank you.
Wonderful. Mariam, tell us where you're at.
Yeah, no, certainly. So I'm part of In Touch, which is a specialist family violence service, been around for 38 years and Victoria-wide as well. And so we support migrant refugee women through the continuum of family violence, from intake to case management to perpetrator program motivation for change, as well as a legal centre as well. And we use a model of in language and culture. So meaning any that one comes across, we connect with them with the migration story as well as language and culture as well. And sector and community in particular, my particular portfolio, it looks into doing projects which are Victoria-wide as well as nationally, as well as engaging with multicultural communities as well, to see, you know, what works for them and working in that collaboration and partnership and having them drive the programs that move forward. And the last sort of areas through the recovery process as well, helping women through the recovery and healing as they move forward in their lives.
Maria, I want to ask you firstly, are we just getting more reports of it because there's more awareness about family violence, or do we have a real epidemic? Give us a bit of a sense, given that you're sort of the one who's probably been in this space the longest. Give us a bit of a sense of how big you think the problem is.
I think the problem is huge. I think that it's a pervasive scourge on our society. Again, I'm very inspired by the aspiration attached to the second national plan. We can do this in one generation. As someone who's worked in the sector for 35 years, I'd absolutely like to believe that we can eliminate violence against women and children and non-binary and non-gender conforming communities out there in a generation. What is it going to take? Well, certainly one of those things is to take a closer look at the data. It's hard to know whether there has been a substantial increase. COVID certainly highlighted the increased demand on services, and I certainly want to pay my sort of respect to all those frontline organisations that did a phenomenal job out there. I also really want to acknowledge the role that victim survivors have played. Irrespective, it's been the work of those sectors of our community that have brought this issue to the fore. Whether the increase is about reporting or we are actually seeing a real increase, the fact remains that we need to address a number of of barriers that still exist in reporting, including how data is collected. And I know we're going to talk about that a little bit more. But irrespective, Karen, I think it's a society-wide problem, one that cuts across every single strata of our differences in society, but one that demands urgent attention.
And just everybody, those of you in the audience, you will get an opportunity to speak and put some questions in the chat. So if you've got something specifically to any of our panelists or more generally, but yes, please do. You will get in the latter half of this presentation. Manjula, an area you've been looking at is dowry abuse, obviously constrained to that sort of South Asian community. Tell us about the work you've been able to do there to, improve awareness, improve outcomes for what is a very, very distressing kind of family abuse.
So I think that to put it in context, it needs to be stated that dowry abuse is a form of financial abuse, and financial abuse is a universal problem. And in my clinical practice, I continuously audit my patients, and I have known financial abuse amongst domestic violence patients to be present in 100% of cases. But then within that, we have the subset from the South Asian community where the special form of financial abuse that occurs in a culturally nuanced manner is around the marriage. So gifts that are given during, before, after marriage that are oversized gifts are called dowry. And that happens in many cultures. It's not just South Asian culture. In the South Asian culture, it's the bride that gives the gifts, and whereas in some Middle Eastern and some of the African cultures, it's the groom that gives the gifts. So dowry can occur in any culture. And where there is a strong, pernicious, or toxic form of gender inequality, then that, and where the power balance between the two parties is big, then that opens up a space for abuse and violence. And so dowry abuse occurs largely facilitated in Australia by migratory process, because the power imbalance between the sponsoring person and the sponsored person, who usually is the victim survivor, becomes quite big, because the sponsor has a lot of power over the future of their life. So
we'll pick up on more of that visa issues, because I know you've all got some thoughts on that. I do want to say, Mariam, you're newest to this. What surprised you, or were you taken aback with when you joined this sector?
In general, I think what was quite incredible to see was, I guess, even the practitioners themselves, how devoted they are to supporting victim survivors. And coming in, I guess, into this particular space, I didn't fully understand the nuances as well of, I guess, how the system and processes worked, and the difficulties that, victim survivors face through that process, and many barriers that they're encountering as well. So I think that was a really insightful thing by going into this particular space, and also just knowing what services are available. A lot of that information is not always available to the multicultural communities or diverse communities to know what pathways they can take to even get that level of support. And I think what we're going to mention a bit later is about the temporary visas as well, just seeing, again, just the multiple complexities that happen with individuals and the families, and, what more support that's actually needed even within Australia to help, these victim survivors through this process. And I guess the other thing that I've learned a lot through this process is actually listening to victim survivors. What an important role that they have in embedding and improving our practices, and how important it is to have them at the forefront and being heard as well.
So I'm going to go again to you, Maria, given your extent of the time you've spent in the industry. What are the changes and the progress that you have seen? And then let's contrast that with, I guess, some of the frustrations of what hasn't changed.
As someone who I suppose was working as a community legal worker at what was then known the Domestic Violence and Incest Resource Centre, my goodness, things have changed. We didn't even have a piece of legislation. So what we were dealing with at that stage was really building awareness around what is family and domestic violence, trying to engage many of the institutions around it, but repeatedly hearing things like, oh, it's just a domestic, oh, it's a private affair, you shouldn't get involved. No, there's no room for actually law around this, let alone criminalising some of the behaviours that might exist out there. The introduction at the time of the Crimes Family Violence Act, as it was known, was a significant act of reform, and it feels to me that we've gone forward with that. We now engage in a discourse and dialogue that understands that family and domestic violence is something that impacts on our entire communities, that it's something that demands that institutions respond, that it is about power and control, that it fundamentally impacts profoundly on children. So a greater recognition, I think, of the complexity associated with that, a greater acknowledgement, as Mariam said, around the importance of victim-led responses. I think a much more nuanced understanding of a trauma-informed approach. We are certainly becoming more sophisticated around that. We have an evidence base. We have significant research institutions. My goodness, we now have the second National Action Plan. So I think we really should be heartened by the degree of change. We are becoming more and more acutely aware of how insidious this issue is in our communities. Where are the frustrations? The frustrations for me are that I, 35 years ago was talking about the importance of collecting ethnicity data, the importance of understanding that culture is not an excuse for family and domestic violence, of speaking to mainstream colleagues about the significance of avoiding racialised understandings. Oh, it's those communities that are particularly barbaric. Oh, family and domestic violence only happens in those communities. Sadly, these are things I still hear in 2022. I'm yet to see a comprehensive set of data questions that go to the heart of how prevalent is this in multicultural communities. I can't tell you that right now because we don't have a comprehensive set of data. I still cannot say with a degree of confidence that we have mainstream frontline organisations that are culturally competent and able to respond in a way that does recognise the unique impact of family and domestic violence on our communities. In terms of our own communities, I really spend a lot of time saying, look, faith and culture should not be presented as a deficit. It should not be presented as an excuse to family and domestic violence. For me, my culture is a source of strength. So let's not forget the protective factors associated with survival, resilience, and all of those things. They're the things I still see gaps in.
Yep.
Manjula, how much is racism and stereotyping a factor and hindering progress in the sector?
Yep. So I just first want to pick up on Maria's point about cultural strengths. So in our NGO that I founded in 2012, the Australasian Centre for Human Rights and Health, that's exactly what we do. We use the culture to actually create awareness, to highlight where the strengths are, and to use those strengths to create educational programs that produce attitudinal change. And so, for example, currently we are doing a community participatory theatre. And in this, what we have is we invited community volunteers through ads, social media ads, to bring their stories and take part. So we first did focus groups so we could understand where they're at. And those focus groups gave us significant information around what the needs of the community are. That sets us up for the next step, that we bring in the community members. We ask them to invite them to join us and bring their life experience around what they have seen and what they would like to see. And so, for example, one man told me how we were in a group setting. So we had about 20 community volunteers. And this senior gentleman said that his neighbor used to beat up his wife every night after drinking alcohol. And everyone in the neighborhood said, that's not our problem. And in the morning, he would wake up and he would be the nicest gentleman. And again, people would say, why would you interfere in his life? And so we were able to catch those kind of stories, and we created very polished skills. So people's knowledge and people's awareness have been turned into small skits. And these skits we then present to the community, who then take part in the conversation about what those skits imply and what is driving it. And so therefore the spectators become spect actors, meaning the whole thing becomes one, the audience and the theater actors through the mediator have conversation and create a narrative, a community narrative around what it means, why is it important, and what should we do about it. So we have stories like that around dowry abuse, like how a migrant woman can be so vulnerable to extortion for money, because if she doesn't pay up the cash that this person is demanding, then she is threatened that she will be deported because he will withdraw the sponsorship. And we got the community to start talking about it. And the interesting thing was the community members, each and everyone said how common that practice is. And they have all seen someone in their social network go through this problem. And so,
fascinating. Mariam, I want to pick up on, I guess one of the things that we've all started to understand is that, to Manjula's point about, the man who used to slap his wife, that's what we used to think was traditionally right. Unless you had a bruise, it wasn't family violence. But now we understand coercive control, financial control, obviously dowry abuse as well. Tell me about the challenges you have in trying to make people aware of their rights and understand what they can do about it when, we still have some pretty backward ideas about what family violence can be.
Yeah, no, that's very true as well. And even Australia and Victoria is, only more recently advanced in those particular spaces. And so for many just different communities as well, when you have so many other things going on at the same time, to put family violence at the centre is not always the case as well. So going into communities, being able to do it in such a way that it does have meaning for them. And as you sort of mentioned, coercive control, it all sort of intersects as well between, dowry abuse, financial control and coercive control, and what that means. And through examples already given, when it comes through migration sort of abuse, saying, threatening her that, if you don't do as I say, I'm going to deport you back, or, you won't have your children. From the financial abuse, for women not having any, financial access or having a job, or at times when people not even knowing what visa they're on as well. So it's really hard with the many, understandings. Many don't know, what family violence is and the different forms that it takes place. And, they've already gone through maybe so much in the past, coming here through, trauma and so forth, and sort of, balancing that out of what family violence means over here to maybe what's happened back home, even if they've been grown up here, the different nuances that happen in that particular space as well. So a lot of education is still required, but even beyond education as well, being able to engage into those communities and offer, a streamlined process, and getting rid of those barriers that are systemic barriers are there as well.
Manjula, I want to talk a little about, was somebody wanting to butt in?
No, I was just going to pick up on the barriers and racism.
Yeah, so and there are barriers and racism and that threat of visa where you may not actually know what your rights are. So what kind of change needs to happen to ensure that that visa process is not abused by perpetrators? Manjula, what do you think?
So basically, one of the things that we do a lot is advocacy with the Home Affairs Department. And so we actually, there is a big national group, and we call it the National Advocacy Group, to which In Touch belongs, as well as my organization, Australasian Center, also belongs. I'm not sure. I think Safe and Equal also belong to that group. And we have a big document prepared for the Home Affairs to look at what they can do to support the people, firstly, who are on temporary visas, whose sponsorship has been withdrawn. And in the past, when there were women who were on tourist visa and abandoned, so to speak, or have been subjected to so much violence, and then the police have intervened and the separation has occurred. So these may be women on tourist visas or brought in by their partners, or there may be people who are partners of skilled migrant visas, of student visas. These are the women who are very vulnerable, and people on partner visas who are not on a permanent residency yet. So what we are saying to the Home Affairs Department is that these are the women who do get deported, because their stories often are not believed even by the Home Affairs, and that they believe the sponsor because he's got all the power and he feeds all the information to the Home Affairs Department. And so we are asking the Home Affairs Department to look at these people, firstly, that they are unlikely that they will be making up stories of such abuse and violence and calling the police just for the sake of getting a permanent residency visa here. That, people do lie. There are some people who lie, but most of the times these are real, genuine stories. And the Home Affairs Department, I am so pleased to say, along with Maria's comments of how much change has happened, that in the last 4 or 5 months, the Home Affairs Department attitude has completely changed and have become much more understanding of the issues that these women are going through. And they even talk to us directly to actually ask what is happening here so that they don't get the decision, that they get the facts right, rather than have the perpetrators only version of it. So so the Home Affairs Department is liaising with people who are working in the sector like us, and that is the first thing they can do. And the second thing they need to do is that when the visas are being issued in the home country, we are advocating for paper-based pamphlets to be given to the people who are getting the visa, so they know where to contact when they are, if they get into trouble. Because at the moment they get given links. Now, how many people read a link? When you are getting married, you obviously imagine your life is going to be most wonderful, and you never want to think about domestic abuse or dowry demands. Who wants to think about that? And so the links from all the patients I have seen, I think the links have been used by no more than a handful of patients, and I will have seen hundreds over the years. And so we do think that the Department of Social Services and Home Affairs need to put their head together to see how we can get this over the line. But the third point that I really want to emphasize is that my organization, the Australasian Center, funded by the federal government, we have created a very interactive, highly nuanced stories of nuanced migrant stories that actually use adult learning principles that help the migrants to understand the differences between their culture, their country's way of looking at domestic violence and gender relations as compared to what happens in Australia, so they can learn the difference and not fall in between the cracks. And so this is something my organization is advocating for to be made almost a part of settlement process, essential almost, so that people know when they come into the country what are the kinds of behavior which will land them into trouble with the law. No one wants to do the wrong thing by the law. No one.
Right, absolutely. Maria, I'm wondering, we had this conversation yesterday, the title, so why doesn't she leave? You want to turn that around. Why doesn't she leave?
Yeah, and I think I said to you, and I'll say it again, Karen, the question itself for me is not only problematic, it can in fact be dangerous. It is a victim blaming statement, and I think it shifts the burden onto her or them. And so to that extent, we need to kind of unpack the implications of putting that term. As a society, I think we need to start saying, why does he do it? Placing the accountability firmly on the shoulders of perpetrators, because no one wants to be abused and no one wants to feel like they then have to defend all the various structural reasons why they're often locked into scenarios, whether it's economic, where, we know what the homelessness stats look like, we know what the issues are around, single mothers and so on. There are countless structural barriers that exist, let alone for migrant refugee women, where those issues are further compounded. I think it's really time that I realise the title was precisely for that reason, so we could have the debate, so we could be saying, where should accountability here rest? And it certainly should never be at the feet or shoulders of those that are being subjected to family and domestic violence, because ultimately this is about power and control. It's about people who choose to use violence as a way of controlling another human being. The right to live free from violence is a fundamental human right.
Those of you in audience land, please do put your questions in the chat. We'll come to you in about 10 minutes or so. Mariam, I'm wondering, how do you bring men into the conversation? They're such an important part of this equation. We know that there are, it's complex why men, and we know it's mostly men. 95% of perpetrators are men. We understand there are some women, but why? There are family pressures. They're feeling financial pressure, etc. How do you bring in men into the conversation to ensure they've got a better understanding of what they're doing and that it's not acceptable?
Yeah, so we actually have a program called Motivation for Change, and that's for perpetrators, men who use violence as well. And we use the same sort of model of having it in language, in culture, as well as being trauma informed. And it is delivery model in such a way that we challenge harmful attitudes and behaviours using culture, language and community as a strength-based response as well. And the great thing about it is the trainers themselves also, again, have that sort of understanding of their migration story and can engage with them in a way that's still engaging but not colluding with them at the same time. And this particular program has got 80 to 90% success rate of retention. So the men do want to go through this particular program, and it's also done on a modelling basis. So those who do come across later, it's the other men who are supporting, guiding them through that as well. So looking at programs that actually specifically are for them and, tailoring it to their needs is what's required to have men included in this process as well.
Yeah, I think that the question whether how to engage men in this space is a difficult one, because the one thing that needs to be stated again and again, and this is a line by a Norwegian sociologist who said, when one man commits a crime and does domestic violence, that's a personal crime. That's a crime. But when there are thousands of men keeping thousands of women in ignorance, that is structural violence. That is not personal violence. And it requires a structural response. It requires a public response. That is the point that it seems that we are not able to get across. And most men who have read my book have told me how embarrassed they felt about reading what is going on with women. But there are not very many men who read my book, but I have received countless messages from women reading and saying how absolutely educational that book has been for them and shown them ways of conceptualizing the problem. And so that's the message. This is a structural problem. We need the men across all structures of society to come in and work with us rather than feel embarrassed and hide, because we're not blaming any one person. It's the whole of society that is part of it. And that's what we need to get across, which I think we are at the moment, as the women's groups have become activated, energized, and working very hard. But the male participation in that is inadequate.
Maria, your thoughts? It's a space you've been in for a long time. We've always known, we're so reactive.
Old here, Karen.
Sorry?
You're starting to make me feel old here.
No. I'm just bowing to your brilliant experience. So you would have seen those attitudes change over time. So how do you meaningfully bring men into the conversation and have them understand that they are a big part of the change?
I think that some things have changed and then others haven't. I think there's still widespread attitudes there, and we see it again and again with the National Community Survey and so on. We've got a lot of work to do. There's no question about that. Attitudes that I think are still steeped and entrenched in various kind of societal norms and so on. So the work is still cut out for us. But yes, there have been significant changes. And I think one of those has been a broad acceptance that the driver really is gender inequality through that intersectional lens, that we need to appreciate that there are some preconditions that are going to help here. And gender equality is one of those big ones. And having said that, I'm someone that really thinks that you can't look at gender without looking at race, without looking at class, without looking at the full spectrum of diversity that shapes our lived experience. In terms of how we address some of those attitudes, I think both Manjula and Mariam are right, that we need to see this through that lens of collaboration, of working together, because it is an issue that impacts all of us. And certainly those that I think are rendered most vulnerable are the children. We've yet to fully understand and appreciate how this impacts on children who are not indirect witnesses. They are indeed direct victims of family and domestic violence, irrespective of the argument that I hear sometimes, but I didn't hit the children. Well, in fact, the impact of violence on children is equally as profound. So I think we need to acknowledge those and address those sort of attitudes that assume the impact isn't broader than that immediate sort of effect. I think in terms of engaging, though, with men in our diverse communities, we need to appreciate that a one size does not fit all. We need to understand that the sort of strategies that are being adopted need to move away from Western models as if they're the only ones of community engagement that exist out there. Over the 35 years, I have seen some incredibly diverse strategies that are grounded in a sophisticated understanding and appreciation that if you align with the values of that community, if you really understand the messaging that works in those communities, you can have a much deeper and much more significant impact. The example that I often draw on, and I want to give a big shout out to the incredible work that these multicultural organisations do, by the way, in responding to issues of family and domestic violence. But the Centre for Muslim Women's Human Rights is a terrific example of how to get that messaging right. Islam opposes violence against women and children. What a tremendous initiative that understood how the communities operate, that worked in a way that extracted, sayings of the Prophet, peace be upon him, condemned violence, made it very clear that the Islamophobic sort of approach that the mainstream organisations might adopt around violence in communities was turned on its head. And I think, again, what was really powerful about that was shifting away from this idea that migrant refugee communities, or women in particular, have no agency, that somehow there's no activism that's happening in these communities. They're simply waiting for the mainstream messaging to take place. That could not be further from the truth. These are communities that are tapping into the strength of faith, of culture, and of going out there and saying culture is no excuse. Don't diminish our communities by even thinking you can use it as a justification. We are communities that stand together and firmly against violence against women, because ultimately it hurts our families, it hurts our communities.
We've had a couple of questions from the audience about intervening, how you intervene. In particular, Manjula, have those fabulous skits, that acting, has that made any difference and made it easier for people to intervene, to recognise it and say this isn't on?
Yes, so we have done evaluation of our programs, and this theatre program and the one before then, which I mentioned that we are advocating to the government, mutual relational respect. We have shown how our programs can create awareness of what is non-physical forms of violence. So everyone understands a slap is a violent behavior, but a lot of people don't understand that if you enforce your wife to become pregnant, that is control. Or if you enforce a termination, that's a form of control. Or if you say to the woman that because you can't have children, you are not a good enough woman, or that you have to do the domestic servitude towards the whole family. So now, so we know that attitudes can change. We have shown that in our projects through our evaluative techniques, and that this is the kind of intervention that needs to happen, I believe, with migrants when they are in the country up to a year into the country, so they can get a sense of what the country is, and then compare and learn, and the knowledge and wisdom that they have already adapted slightly to the Australian environment. And so there are very innovative ways. We use arts and discussion to create change. And I think that these are things that need to really be used more widely, because lectures are often boring and they don't change hearts and minds.
Mariam, have you come across some innovative projects that you've seen work along those lines? Because I just find that so inspiring, I have to say, Manjula. I just think that's amazing. Have you come across some sort of similar thinking outside the square to get the message out?
Into, I guess, how to approach things. Well, we do go into communities and support them in a way that works best for them. So they come up with the program and we talk to them, and how do you want the messages to go across? And we support, I guess, what that message might be, recognizing, referring and responding, referring across in that way. And they do it through many prevention ways, or going to the place where they might go worship, to go directly to them, and having that in language as well also makes such a big difference as well. So just in a way that works with them, we hear from them and tailor it accordingly as well. And one area that we work in is, I guess, getting that message across, but we also work in the other spectrum side of things as well. So when women have experienced family violence, how do we support them in those very barriers that we talked about before around financial, I guess, independence and social connections as well. So we have a program called Inspire, and with that we support women in those two core streams, because they have been so isolated, don't have any funds, and have all those systemic barriers. And how do we support them with the employment pathways by doing mentoring and by having access to different employment services, as well as the social connections by having things like Diwali or Eid, so they actually get to meet other people who have similar experiences in a safe space as well. So looking at the both spectrums of, from the prevention to early intervention to all the way into going, well, what do we do once they have experience to help them in their journey moving forward?
Yeah. Maria, you would just intervention. Often families would have met a question here from the floor on, families are often aware of what's going on, but don't know what to do. What's the best advice to assist families to try and intervene? How do you go about it?
So in terms of victim survivors reaching out, or as a bystander?
Well, for families knowing something's going on between a man and a woman, and trying to figure out what steps they should take.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
I think, again, in terms of building awareness around the fact that all of us have a role to play first and foremost, because we certainly don't want to be suggesting interventions can happen easily, that there is a full range of appropriate interventions. And I think that's important. There is a model, if I can also make reference to Lifeline Australia, the model that they use is recognise, respond, refer. And that's a recognition that we can't all be specialist family violence, practitioners out there. And for those of us that are operating at a grassroots community level, an acknowledgement that we do need to understand that there's a reason why specialist family violence services operate out there, but that what we can do is listen. We can listen without disbelief or without judgment. We can validate those lived experiences. We can move away from that question of why doesn't she leave? So when someone does disclose, that they're not met with disbelief or all the various victim blaming responses, that we indeed listen, deeply listen, and understand where that person is coming from. And I think that also tapping into the fact that this disclosure didn't happen overnight, that if we are listening to women, children, families talking to us about family and domestic violence, the confidence to be able to disclose has probably happened over a very long period of time. So for me, I'll often say, what is it that's kept you safe so far? That understanding a strength-based approach through a trauma-informed lens does not seek to come in and profess an intervention that is good for you. It's a collaborative one. It's one that works together with victim survivors and works out what is the best possible option. Because I tell you what, Karen, when a woman says to me, I think he'll kill me if I leave, I'm going to take that very seriously. She is the best narrator of her own life story. I shouldn't be seen as someone to dictate and tell her what the options are, but rather to work with her, but in a way that also says this is not just your issue. This is an issue that all of us have some responsibility here, and that we can work together to try and find ways forward, but one that is based on respect, one that is trauma-informed, and one that recognises the agency of the victim survivor in all of this. I think that's really important.
That's great response, Maria, very comprehensive. I just want to add one line, that to actually ask someone, how are you? Or is there something going on at home that you want to share? Or to actually take them for a cup of coffee if you're worried about them. That is the first aid of domestic violence, just to ask. And this is especially for general practitioners and doctors, because when the patient comes into our consulting room, and I'm a doctor first, so when the patient comes into a consulting room, most of these people have seen a doctor at some point in time. For a doctor to ask the patient, is everything okay at home? Or even do you feel fear? Or do you feel safe at home? That is the first aid of domestic violence. And so if you're a neighbor, or if you have within your home this going on, just take time out to speak to that person with love, care, respect, and regard, without judgment, like it must be your fault because you're the woman. That is often the attitude. And to not suggest that she leave, because leaving a home, especially for a migrant woman in a country who she doesn't know anyone, it is not easy at all. The second difficulty is that those women who often have a strong identity of being a married woman, surviving as a single woman causes identity crisis. And I've seen a lot of that, and to support them through that process of reconceptualizing your identity as a single woman, it just so takes a while and a lot of therapy to do that. It doesn't happen overnight because the society has drummed it into the woman's head that your role in life is to be a married woman and to be a mother and a wife, and to get away from that is quite hard. And then when she does try to do that, get away from it, then the society comes in and stigmatizes her for being a divorced woman, being a single woman, and it's a shameful thing for her and her family. So, there are all those multiple levels of barriers that people need to consider.
There's a really great question come in from the floor. Does family violence beget family violence? Meaning a young boy who's witnessed his father be an abuser, will he repeat the abuse when he's grown up and in a relationship? Maria, your thoughts?
Look, I certainly think that there's considerable research out there about intergenerational violence and its impact. I personally think that the violence is a choice. And I think while we can't underestimate the trauma impact of growing up in a family where family and domestic violence is sadly all too regular an occurrence, that impact is profound. I think the issues are not necessarily causal. I think we need to work on those trauma issues for boys growing up, or indeed for girls that might be growing up in that sort of environment. But I think there's a certain sort of danger in then connecting that as being almost kind of determinist, because it takes away that view that violence is a choice. You make a choice to be violent because ultimately it's about control, it's about power. So yes, I think there is considerable effort that we need to put into the way that our society treats boys, all the various gender stereotypes that exist out there. I think that patriarchy hurts boys and men as much as it hurts women in some cases. But nonetheless, I still think violence is a choice, and I think we need to be working on that part. How can I act differently in this sort of context? But the intergenerational effect, undoubted.
Yeah. So,
Mariam, just wondering for you, there's a question here about sporting club and getting into the community where boys are, going to where they are. Is that something that you would see some value in, is actually going to where young boys are and men are and saying, hey, look, you talked about going to mosque, etc. What about broadening out in the community where you find boys?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we're looking to partner with different sporting agencies as well for that very reason, because even sporting agencies are looking into what can they do when it comes to gender equity and leadership in that particular space, and addressing family violence as well. So working with partnerships that know their cohort, where our men are, as you said, and the young boys as well, but working that collectively and with collaboration and our specialist skills to get that message across will make such a world of difference as well. And with the project we're looking to do in the future, we're working with different multicultural agencies as well in the Western region. And again, by getting their lenses, their voices across, makes such a big impact by getting that collective, strengths that we have. Like, they know the communities, we understand family violence, and they also understand the sports by having that collaboration in that way. And embedding in existing programs, I think, is the best way as well. Something's working, is there, then how can we improve it by having that message sent across?
Yeah. All right, we're almost out of time. I'm going to get everybody to do that big question that I put to you yesterday. What is the one thing that could change today that would make the biggest difference? Manjula.
I would say the biggest thing that would make a difference would be to support the migrants as they're coming into the country, to let them know what the laws in the country are and what the expectations are, to share that in a way that respects their previous knowledge and builds on that so they can adapt better to the country that they are in.
Maria.
Oh, dismantle patriarchy? No, can we do that overnight? I think that would be useful. Look, Can I actually answer by reflecting? Very recently, I had the privilege of helping to launch a Pacifica wellbeing project that had as its focus wellbeing and family and domestic violence in Pacifica communities. And one of the things that I thought could easily change was, what if we did reconceptualise our approach to family and domestic violence? One where we had holistic interventions that integrated community, family, community and faith groups, because I think there's still lots of scope to work with faith groups. But that particular project to me typified how successful we could be if we reconceptualised those strategies, if we understood it through a collectivist and not just an individualist lens, and that we brought the whole community with us. Very powerful.
Mariam.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree with the suggestions already given, and sort of touching on base what we sort of mentioned before was around the bridging visas for all temporary visa recipients as well, of women who experience family violence. We know the provisions are there, but just for particular spousal visas, we want to be able to broaden that, have that for 3 years, women to have access to services in that time and to be reassessed as well. So we would definitely think that's an area we need to be able to do more advocacy on.
And I guess one area that I just want to touch on very briefly, we're almost out of time, but is, same-sex couples, which can be very culturally difficult. I'm wondering if each of you might be prepared just to weigh in very briefly about the challenges there in some of these communities. Manjula.
So basically, it's a very intriguing way of handling the problem in collectivist societies like the South Asian, where the young men and women are destined to get married, like there is no choice almost. And so people who are gay, LGBTQI, for them, there is no other choice but to think about marriage. And so what we see is a lot of hidden bisexuality, enforced bisexuality. So the men are generally gay, or maybe even women, but we know more about men, and that they seem to then turn into, it becomes a situation where they tend to use violence because they don't want to be there. And so that is a very a common situation that I come across. But even within the same-sex couples, we do know domestic violence exists because this is about power abuse. So it's power of one over another, and the one who is more vulnerable, either through resources or through migrant status or through other means. And the third point of homosexuality in at least in India is a very interesting thing, that transgender women are actually really welcome in at times of festivals. They are seen to bring good luck when a child is born. So they are invited into the family to do a song and a dance, and they get given gifts for blessing the child. So, we do have all these contradictions, and we can use them to our advantage.
Maria, quickly.
The application, I think, of an intersectional lens, very welcome in the next national plan, means that inevitably we have to look at this idea of not universalising anybody's experience. It's great that the national plan does indeed make reference to transgender women and non-binary and so on. So I think it's a message to our communities that this is ultimately about a human rights issue, that we all have the right to live our lives free from violence. One of the problems, though, in our LGBTIQ communities is that often misidentification will happen. So I think we really need to spend a lot of time educating institutions as much as we do communities about what power and control looks like.
Mariam, last word for you.
Yeah, I'm also in agreement about the intersectional links that happens as well. And, we are open to all those who identify as women and working in collaboration with those who are experts in this field as well. So Switchboard and other communities, transgender communities, they are, lived experience and gay, they understand it, and working with them to, to be more open and inclusive.
Thank you, everybody. I think from our audience, a virtual hand clap for our fabulous panelists here. Professor Manjula O'Connor, Department of Psychiatry Professor at the University of Melbourne. Maria Dimopoulos, the Director and Principal Consultant at Miriam Kofkin Global. Mariam Chowdhury at the In Touch Multicultural Centre Against Family Violence. Now, this conversation can be revisited at the AIS YouTube page. And Friday, I'll remind you, is the UN International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. And I think we've taken some really constructive, innovative, and heard of some innovative steps here today. So I thank you, the wonderful panelists. I thank Ahmet and his team at the AIS for putting together this panel and constantly ensuring that we are having these challenging but inspiring conversations. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.